Hi everybody. Before I started, I'm going to read a book, but before I start reading the book, I wanted to talk to you, to my fourth graders and anybody else who's listening, about the importance of school. So during these crazy times right now, we're not in school and we don't get to see our teachers. I don't get to see you all every day. We don't get to see our friends every day. We're all really grateful for Zoom because we get to see each other on Zoom. But I know some of you might be struggling with doing schoolwork, and that is certainly understandable. But it is important that you are doing some schoolwork, and the reason is you need to keep your brain active. You need to keep your body active as well, but we don't want you to kind of forget the things that we learned when we were in school together, and there are some other things that we want to introduce before you end your fourth grade year. So, that being said, school is important, online school like we're trying to do now, but your mental and emotional health, your heart, is also super, super important, and more important right now, actually, than schoolwork. So, if you are doing schoolwork, you don't have to put in a full 7-hour day like we would do when we were at school. I would like you to be doing math and doing some summarizing and finding a main idea for language arts. Some of the science stuff is really fun. Expedition is fun. These are things that I would like you to be doing throughout the week, but you can make up your own schedule, whatever works for you and your family. And if you're starting to feel stressed, you need to step away from what you're doing. If you're doing math and you're getting super frustrated, take a break. Go get a drink of water. Go get a snack. Go do some physical activity. That's okay. We want the best for you. So no additional stress to be doing work, but it is really important still to keep your mind active and to be doing some of the schoolwork that I'm sending out every week. So that's what I have to say about school. I am going to read you a story now. It's called Two Mrs. Gibsons. I love this story. I once knew two Mrs. Gibsons. This Mrs. Gibson was tall. Her skin was the color of chocolate. She was born in America in a place called Tennessee. This Mrs. Gibson was small. Her skin was the color of vanilla. She was born in Japan in a place called Gaifu. This Mrs. Gibson gave hugs like you were being wrapped up in a great big fat bearskin rug. "Come here and give me some sugar," she would say. This Mrs. Gibson gave hugs that were like being wrapped up in a light, down-filled comforter. At bedtime she'd stroke my hair and hum Sakura until I fell asleep. This Mrs. Gibson was loud. She had a big laugh and a big voice, which would always get louder when she was angry or when she was singing. And she seemed to be singing all the time. "This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine." This Mrs. Gibson was quiet. She would cover her mouth when she laughed, so you could never see her teeth. And when she got angry, she got even quieter. This Mrs. Gibson had small hands and could make the littlest, prettiest strokes of a pen which she would write our names in Japanese. Ku mi ki, a ki mi, to yo mi, yo shi ti ru. This Mrs. Gibson had big hands. They looked like they covered all the keys on the piano when she played her favorite spirituals. "This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine." Sometimes this Mrs. Gibson would look kind of sad, and then she would dress me up in one of the kimonos she had packed away in an old trunk. "These very special," she would say as she tied the obi around my waist. "Don't get dirty." The other Mrs. Gibson's clothes were much too big for me to dress up, but I liked to wear her fancy hats. "This is my Sunday going to meeting hat," she would say, and she'd take out a long pointy hat pin out of my hand. "Don't get it dirty now." In the evening in the garden, this Mrs. Gibson would help me make magical lamps by catching fireflies and putting them in jelly jars. They would glow and glow, and then we'd let them go. Later at dinner time, this Mrs. Gibson would make more magic. Her hands would turn little bits of napkins into whole flocks of long-necked cranes. We would throw them into the air where they would fly high and then flutter down to the ground. "Happy birds," she would always say. This Mrs. Gibson always had a pot of rice cooking. We would eat little bits of meat and vegetables on it and plenty of shoyu. Anytime we were hungry, she could take her long chopsticks and stir up the dinner in a blink of an eye. This Mrs. Gibson always had a pot of greens cooking. Turnip greens, dandelion greens, mustard greens from the garden. Everything she cooked seemed to take a long, long time. This Mrs. Gibson had short, curly hair that she would oil and braid up every night while she listened to the radio. She liked to braid my hair too, but she would always give me one big fat braid that would hang down over my forehead. I didn't like that braid, so I would go to the other Mrs. Gibson and she'd take it out. This Mrs. Gibson used to have long, stick-straight hair, but she cut it short and tried to make it curly. She said she wanted to be more American. This Mrs. Gibson's other name was Kazumi. Everyone called her Kaz or Connie because they couldn't pronounce Kazumi. I called her Mommy because she was my mother. This Mrs. Gibson's other name was Viola. Everyone called her Vi or Reverend Gibson because she was a church minister. I called her Nanny because she was my grandmother. I once knew two Mrs. Gibsons. They were very different, but had a lot in common. They both loved my daddy, and they both loved me. I love that story. So I hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, sending you lots of love, and I wish you well.